Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
I wonder if the reason why there are fewer people here today is because they knew that today was going to be a grammar day, and they figured they would just play hooky. Because we were talking about this because I have no idea if we're going to finish this Rashi. It's actually it's a Rashi that speaks to my heart because I love this kind of stuff. But I imagine it might be dry for all of you. I don't mind saying from the beginning that we're not going to get much out of this in terms of content. I've read this over and over and over again. I don't think that there's a sermon here. I don't think that there's a reason for his going on this extended journey we're about to go on, aside from just clarifying a grammatical point. I do have a question that can't be answered as to why he's going to give so many examples for something when the point that he's making is pretty rosh katan. You know, it's pretty small. It's small potatoes. So, and he's going to give 3 or 4 examples of the idea that he's about to undermine, and then 4 or 5 examples of the one that he supports. And you'll tell me afterwards if you think there's a reason for this extended conversation by Rashi. But just to get us in there, we're on the 22nd verse of the 3rd chapter of Shemot, the last chapter of Shemot, and the pshat, which we've spent some time on for a while, or the verse is V'shala isha mishchenta. Each woman will ask, borrow, request, demand from her neighbor. Umi garat beita. We didn't fully resolve that. And from the woman who lives in her home. Is the her the Israelite woman, or is the her the woman who lives in the home of her neighbor? Right. We spent some time on that. We're not going backwards. What shall they borrow or ask for? Klei chesef uchlei zahav, instruments or utensils of silver and of gold, usmalot, and garments, dresses, v'samtem, and place them, al b'nechem, on your sons, v'al b'notechem, upon your daughters, v'nitzaltem et mitzrayim, which we basically translated as you shall take advantage of, you shall strip. I talked about the fact that in modern Hebrew, linatzel means to exploit, in both the positive and the negative sense, right? To exploit an opportunity to get as much out of it as possible, and to exploit, take advantage of. Okay, and it seems to be that that's the standard understanding, that this is the root lin natzel shoresh nun tzadi lamed, meaning to exploit, take advantage of, or strip. Okay, that's where we left it. And I think, unless someone wants to correct me, what we're about to do is this long Rashi, right? Because we already did the short Rashi on Migarat Beita. Everyone agree with that? Okay. Is there a masochist out there who wants to volunteer to read this Rashi? It's going to be a lot of interruptions. I'm going to be sharing my screen with you about 15 different times, because each of the verses he's going to bring up primed. But anybody want to jump into it? Tova, is that you're raising a hand? No, that's you're telling me, on me you shouldn't rely. That's what you're saying. All right, eeny, meeny, miny.
I'll be brave.
Okay, go ahead, Joanna. Thank you.
V'nitzatem ketargumo utrokenun v'chein vayinatzlu et mitzrayim.
Okay, pause. We're going to do this really slow, slowly. So what's the first thing that Rashi says?
It's that according to the Aramaic translation, utrukenun, which I have no idea what that means.
Okay, so that's what's interesting about him going in this direction. I mean, that's the way Uncle's translates it, is that he's in the service of deciphering an interesting root that sometimes appears in different ways. He's using, and I think this is just a coincidence, just what the word means, another root, which is also interesting, and it appears in different ways. The adjective for this root is missing one of the letters of the verbal root. The adjective is reish yud kuf, rake, empty. Habor rake ein bo mayim, right? That the pit into which Joseph was sent was empty; it had no water. But the verb to empty out is liroken. There's a nun hanging out at the end of that verbal form, which does not appear in the adjectival form. And there are a lot of people who know the Hebrew word rake, empty, but don't know how to, are not as aware that in the verbal form. So, and this is the Aramaic of that. So, I lost my place. Yeah. So, tiroknun, you shall empty out. right? You shall dispossess, right? You shall make them have less of, with the root being resh kun kuf nun. Okay, so the first thing he says is Onkelos got it right, and this is actually a fair Aramaic translation of linatzel, with the meaning being to take advantage of, to empty out, to strip. Okay. V'chein.
Vayinatzlu et Mitzrayim. So there's we can look at Shemot Yud Bet and find a similar expression there.
Right. So let me share that. Okay. So when this story is told a little bit later, right? So we're actually seeing the instructions, and then in the 12th chapter of Shemot, right, it actually happens, right? So if you go back to verse 35, Uvnei Israel asu kidvar Moshe, the Israelites did exactly as Moshe had commanded them. Vayishalu, same verb, right? They asked, borrowed, requested from Egypt. Interesting, not Mitzrayim, but from Egypt. Klei chesed, uklei zahav, usmalot. So it matches that they asked for these silver, gold instruments and garments, clothing. Vadonai natan et chen ha'am. We looked at this verse last time from the previous verse. God placed the grace of the people be'enei Mitzrayim, in the eyes of Egypt. Vayashilum, and they answered the she'elah. They gave it to them, and now vayinatzelu et Mitzrayim. They natzaled Mitzrayim. And if you look at Onkelos on this, to form, Onkelos translates the vayinatzlu as verokinu, resh kun kuf nun. So the first thing Rashi says is, Onkelos was right in our verse, in our chapter, the last verse of chapter 3, and it's the same root when the story is told later on, and Onkelos is true to form there. This means to empty out, to take advantage of. Okay. Keep going.
Let's go on.
Yeah.
Vayinatzlu v'nei Yisrael et Edyam. So also in Shemot Lamed Gimel, another example of the same form.
Right. So now that Rashi, the first proof text that Rashi brought is not only the same root, it's the same phrase referring to this scene. And now Rashi extends it a little bit and gives us another proof text. Let me pull that one up. So in the 33rd chapter of the book of Shemot, this is in Parshat Ki Tisa. This is same root according to Rashi, but a different context. Just go back a verse. This is in the scenes around the golden calf. Vayomer Nai Moshe, God said to Moshe, a moral b'nei Israel, tell those people, atem am kshe oref, they are a people of stiff-necked. Rega echad a'aleh b'kirbacha. If I were to come down for 1 minute, v'chiliticha, I would destroy you. V'ata horeid edyecha. Therefore, take off that stuff that you put on to dance in front of the golden calf, me'alecha, from upon you, ve'eda'a ma'esalach, and I'm going to figure out what to do with you. Vayinatzlu b'nei Israel et yadam mehar chorev. So the Israelites, this is in the hit pa'el, reflexive. Whatever natsal means, they did it to themselves, and it's an interesting form because a hit pa'el often does not have a direct object. So the et edyam, this might be not et as direct object, but et as with, right? That they strip themselves with respect to edyam, the fine stuff they put on, mechar chorev, from that point on forward, right? So Rashi says, same root, they made themselves empty, if I want to keep that word going, from the beautiful stuff that they put on as they were celebrating at the golden calf. Okay. So far, Rashi has told you what he thinks it means. He says Onkelos is right. He says Onkelos it translates it the exact same way when this story is told in real time as it's happening. And I'll give you another verb where it means the same thing. Although interestingly, Onkelos does not translate this vayitnatzlu on the screen the way he does the others. And so that's probably why Rashi doesn't bring it. If you look here, Onkelos translates the verb vayitnatzlu as it's hard to even pronounce, va'adiu, basically using the verbal form of the edyam. If think of to It doesn't work in English. If you're wearing finery, imagine a verb meaning to fine oneself. So Onkelos takes the verb from the noun of the stuff that they're wearing. He does not translate it as lihitrokein here. Okay, that's what Rashi's done so far, and he's about to turn kind of 90 degrees, 180 degrees. Let's pause because I see Barry has a question or a comment.
My translation has an interesting twist on the word. It's divest.
Interesting. This the translation of the Rashi or of the verb in the sentence?
Both. Actually, in the translation from Onkelos is the same word as to empty. Uh-huh. But in the translation of the same word in Rashi and also in the text is divest. And your use of the word to fine as to refine, or it's not to take away. It's still an investment. It's still what it is. Uh-huh. It's a divesting it.
Yeah. And as we go through this, I guess if there's anything of content to be thinking about is the machloket that Rashi is about to get into between himself and his version of Jastrow. I think we refer to him usually Menachem ben Saruk, who was like a 11th or 10th century grammarian who apparently had a pretty widespread dictionary of biblical Hebrew and rabbinic Hebrew. And that's, if I go to the Jastrow, Rashi would go to the Menachem ben Saruk. The difference is if I go to Jastrow, I believe he's right. I would never say, I don't think Jastrow is right here. But Rashi has no problem saying that Menachem ben Saruk was incorrect. He's about to get into machloket with him. Obviously, he in this situation is no longer alive, about the meaning of this verb. And I guess if we could linger on a question is, what is the difference, if there's a difference, between the possible meanings of these roots? Rashi's gone in one direction. He's about to quote Menachem ben Saruk in the other direction. Larry, Diane?
First, I'm just wondering whether, I don't have the Aramaic in front of me, it could be to adorn as opposed to fine.
Yeah, that's probably a better example. To adorn and adornment. That probably works better, except that Rashi... Not an except. In this case, Onkelos is using it almost as a way of saying to unadorn, right? Because to dedorn, we can create a verb.
And then I'm wondering, are you waiting to go through the Rashi before you look at other translations of the actual, if not the verse, at least the word?
Not necessarily. Did we not look at translations last week of the verb itself?
I'm sure we did not because I would have remembered, because our school, of course, goes right to the Rashi, the first Rashi, and says to empty, you shall empty out Egypt. And Alter says despoil. And Ari Kaplan says drain. He says drain Egypt, and then he puts in parentheses of its wealth. And then Barry's was in, I don't know where Barry's was from, but Barry's was really interesting, to divest. Because that's I think a really interesting term to use in this case.
For the 10,000th time, translation is so hard and so interesting because all those words make sense in context. Spoil, divest, Everfox says strip. What was the other one you mentioned? A drain. I mean, drain is a different image than to empty, right? But you know what it's going for. But I think all of those translations are synonyms, agreeing with Rashi, agreeing with Onkelos, right? These are all different English ways of really saying the same thing. And what Rashi's got to do is to prove that that's correct by disproving the alternate reading that Menachem ben Saruk came up with. Yeah. Go ahead, Diane.
So I don't know if we want to deal with this right now because it really isn't germane to translation, except that Rashi, using the example that he did, makes very stark that God first told the people to despoil the Egyptians, and then the people used those spoils in order to create the golden calf is rather fascinating. Yeah.
Right. The fascinating second story of stuff that they left Egypt with, right? That they're payment, their compensation for slavery, as it were, at the request or the demand of the God that they're now going to be serving, is used in the undermining of that faith, right? When we get there, there's a really fascinating pshat story and midrashic story about mirrors that the Israelite women brought out of Egypt and how they used them in the desert. There are interesting second stories of the fire pans of Korach. So there's an interesting repurposing of items in the Exodus story that themselves tell their own story. But yes, and Rashi is not at this point showing interest in the storyline. He's showing interest in the verb itself. Yeah,
that's where I like the word divest is like a repurposing.
Repurposing, yeah. Okay, Joanna, let's go back to you, and let's keep going.
Okay. Let me just find my place. V'hanun bo yesod. And the letter nun, I'm taking yesod here to be like shoresh. The nun is part of the base, is part of the shoresh.
Correct. Rashi's word for our word shoresh is yesod, which are synonyms, right? A foundation or a basis. Yep.
Umenachem chibro b'machberet tzadi.
So that's already a phrase. So those four words, see what you can make out of them. Menachem chibro b'machberet tzadi. What does that mean?
Some guy, Menachem, I'm not sure who he's referring to here, wrote in his notebook tzadi.
Right.
I want to say some grammarian listed it in his notebook under tzadi, meaning that the shoresh starts with tzadi.
Absolutely right. So Menachem is this guy, Menachem ben Saruk, who lived, I forgot exactly what century, and he had this dictionary, this machberet. I can't hear the word machberet and not think of those blue machbarot from religious school that's how I learned how to write my Hebrew letters. And he noted it under the heading tzadi, not under the net heading nun, to suggest that whatever shoresh yesod this is, its first letter is not a nun. Its first letter is a tzadi. And what root could that be? It could be tzadi lamed, which is sometimes written in our dictionaries as yud tzadi lamed or hey tzadi lamed, lehatzil, to rescue, to save, right? May or may not be related to the noun sail, which means shade. But whatever it is, in medieval Hebrew, that was listed as a tzadi root, not necessarily as a yud tzadi or a hey tzadi root. Okay, keep going.
Okay, im vayatzel Elohim miknei avichem, and asher hitzil Elohim me'avinu.
Okay, so let's look at some of those. A second. So Rashi is now going to go into he's generous to Menachem, even though he's about to disagree with him. So he's going to lead us in the direction that Menachem ben Saruk wants us to go in terms of understanding this root, but it's all in the service of saying, and he's wrong. Okay, so look at this verse. This is from the 31st chapter of Breshit, Parshat Vayetze, and you can see just from the top there, once you see the word speckled, you know exactly where you are in the story, right? This is the ruse that the genetic engineering that Yaakov does to despoil his father-in-law Yitro of things, not Yitro, Lavan, of parts of the flock that he feels like he deserves. By the way, notice an either coincidental or non-coincidental thing here, that in Rashi taking us to this root as a way of showing how Menachem understands our verse, even though Rashi thinks it's wrong, he's taking us to a story where an Israelite is taking things on the way out that he thought he was due, right? Either that's a nothing or it's majestic. I'm not sure. It may be it actually may be the root that Menachem ben Saruk uses in his dictionary. I don't have a copy of that dictionary. I don't know if it exists online, but it's interesting storyline parallel. So what's going on here? Go back a verse. Im kol yomar nikudim yescharecha. So if he said this, then all of the flock that are speckled is going to be what you earn. V'yaldu kol hatson nikudim, and then all the flocks somehow would come out that way. V'im kol yomar, if he worked it out that if he had said that all of the akudim will be your wages, v'yaldu kol hatson akudim. So he basically, Yaakov set it up. They say, heads I win, tails you lose. Right? So either way he goes, he wins. And in that way, Vayatzel Elohim et miknei avichem vayiten li. By the way, this is what's happening here is Yaakov is describing the situation to Rachel and Leah. He's describing to his wives how he ended up with all these flocks, or how he was going to be. And in that way, he says God has yatzald or natzald or tzald the flocks of your father and given them to me. So, according to Menachem ben Saruk, this root is the same root as our root, and you can understand why, right? They take all of your verbs, despoiled, divested, took away, emptied out the Egyptians' closets from the finery, and here God has made it so that I have been able to empty out Lavan's flock from him, except that this is probably the root lehatzil, meaning to it's a similar idea, but to rescue, to take away, to save, to spare, right? So that's the first example. And then the next one is, later on in that very chapter.
Can I just comment that it's interesting that Rashi does not comment on the word Yatzel back then? But funny that he didn't even have anything to say back then. He only thought of it in the context of our pasuk.
Meaning, in this story, Rashi doesn't say anything?
No, Rashi doesn't say anything on verse 9.
True. Yeah, Rashi's the fact that it's in gray, not black, means that Rashi is quiet on that verse. Yeah. Okay, and then now, a few verses later, why don't you read this verse, Joanna? Ki kol ha'osher.
Ki kol ha'osher asher hitzil Elohim me'avinu lanu hu uvanenu ve'ata kol asher amar Elohim elecha aseh.
Okay, and translate or read the translation.
Truly, all the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, do just as God has told you.
Okay, so the wives basically accept the explanation, and here we have a more obvious verb form, because vayatzel could be one of those roots where the nun has gone missing, like vayipol or vayisa in that form, but hitzil in the past tense, it's a perfect form. There's no way that hitzil, this word here, can be from the root natsal. There's just no way it would show up. So hitzil has to be from tzal or yatzal or lehatzil. And according to Menachem ben Saruk, that is the same verb as we have in our verse. Okay. So that's Rashi having given us two places where Menachem believes we have a similar understanding as what the word means in our verse. And remember, our verse was v'nitzaltem. Okay. Any comments or questions so far, or seeing where we are in the storyline? Okay. Now, Rashi says, but Menachem, you're wrong. Keep reading.
V'lo ye'amnu dvarav, ki im lo hayta hanun yesod, v'hi nekuda b'chirik, lo tehe mishameshet bilshon uf'altem ela bilshon v'nif'altem.
Okay, so see if you can make sense of that. What's the first phrase mean?
We don't believe, or we don't hold by his words.
Yeah, and look at the root there. It's believe amen. We're literally, we're not going to say amen to his words. Lo ye amnu. His words shall not be believable, right, or accepted as at face value. Why?
Because if the nun wasn't part of the shoresh,
which is his way of saying, if Menachem were right, and the nun was not part of the shoresh, but the shoresh was rather lehatzil, go ahead.
Okay, and but it has the chirik vowel, the e vowel.
Right. So the chirik, you don't know, all those who don't know the names of the vowels, is the single dot under a letter, which is an I or an E. There's a long chirik and a short chirik. The short chirik is just the dot. The long chirik is if there's a yud in the next place in a letter. That's a long E vowel or a short E vowel. So if the nun were not part of the root, which is what Menachem ben Saruk is arguing, and the way you have to understand this phrase is, and since it is indeed vocalized as a chirik, if you look at our verse, it's the nitzaltem et Mitzrayim, and under the nun, not only is the nun there, but the nun has a chirik in it, then therefore,
it couldn't be used in the language of, I want to say here, like, because of what's coming up, nifaltem, in the language of an active verb, but only in the language of the passive.
Exactly right. So the way those of us who study biblical grammar now would call the binyan pa'al, active, and the binyan nifal, passive. When Rashi spoke about it, he wouldn't have used the word pa'al. He actually kind of almost like writes out the longer version of that verb as an explanation. So if Menachem is correct and the nun is not part of the root and it's in the nun has a chirik, then there's no way to understand that word as being you, plural, actively are doing something, ufa'altem, what we would say pa'al, but rather you would have to then translate that verb as you, plural, have had something done to you, passive nifaltem. And we'll go longer into it, but if you look back at our verse, Rashi is saying, I'm about to prove to you that if Menachem is correct, that there's a nun there, and it's part of the root, and it's not part of the root, and since there's a chirik under that nun, you would have to somehow translate this verse as place them on your sons and daughters, and you will be despoiled by Egypt. You will be taken advantage of by Egypt. That makes no sense. And Rashi says there's no way to not translate it that way if the nun is not part of the root. And now he's going to go into a series of proofs next to get us there. Questions or comments on that, on just the language that Rashi is using? Barry?
Goodness, it's a premonition that, yes, the Israelites are going to be despoiled. They're taking this stuff, and it's going to spoil them.
Okay, so wonderful, Barry. You're saying that we could midrashically rescue Menachem's translation, that this is a wink at the fact that they're going to take it, but it's actually going to be their undoing. I love it. It's a wonderful response back to Rashi. I think Rashi would say, I'm not interested, but it's a wonderful response back to Rashi. Great. Larry, Diane?
The question is, this presumes that Rashi had the Masoretic text, and that was widespread by then? Otherwise,
in sense that he knew that there was a chirik underneath it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm assuming all along that Rashi is learning from a Torah scroll. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming there aren't Chumashim back then, but maybe obviously I'm wrong.
We're getting into a murky part of text history that I do a lot of guesswork at. I have no scholarly background on it, but here's my sense. Even before there was the accepted Masoretic text, and people were essentially learning from unpointed text, that doesn't mean that they didn't know what vowels ought to be under each letter, right? There may have been, what the Masorites did was to make it so that it was certified and everyone basically had an agreement. But they weren't the ones in real time inventing the concept that these are the way the word should be articulated, because there are, every verse has verbs that, depending on which vowels are present, change the meaning. So I don't know if Rashi literally had the work of the Masorites in front of him, but even if he didn't, he had an inherited tradition that this was pronounced nitzaltem and not nitzaltem, and it seemed to be rather accepted, so much so that he could say, since we all agree, because that's what he's saying, that there's an E underneath there, we all agree it's going to sound like this, this is what it has to mean. Now, maybe what we're seeing here is a disagreement between Rashi and Menachem on that very question. Maybe Menachem, I've never seen that text. I've only seen Menachem ben Saruk quoted by Rashi. I've never seen him quoted by anyone else. So he's Rashi's dictionary, but I don't know if that is extant at all. Maybe we're seeing a difference between Rashi and Menachem ben Saruk on how this verb should be pointed, right? And maybe Menachem ben Saruk say, yeah, but I don't see a chirik there. I see a shvad there. And that would change everything. Okay, so now Rashi is going to bolster his disagreement with Menachem ben Saruk. Go ahead.
Okay, so now some examples. Kamo, v'nisachta me'al ha'adama.
Okay, so let's do this one at a time. And to give you the flow, these are Rashi's examples of what he would say are obvious cases where you have a nun with a chirik underneath it in a form that shows that it's passive, not active. Okay, Dvarim Kaf Chet, the 20th chapter of Deuteronomy, which is, anyone know the context? In this is like name that tune. If you look at that little section of Torah, anyone know what's going on here? Parshat Ki Tavo. This is part of the blessings and curses of Parshat Ki Tavo, okay, the Tochacha, and it's one of the longest chapters in the Torah. V'haya kasher sas Adonai alechem, just as God once was so happy upon you, lehetiv etchem, to be good to you, ulaharbot etchem, and to make you numerous. Ken yasis Adonai alechem. God will now have similar joy, lahavid etchem, to destroy you. It's really like incredible imagery. When we get there in 100 years, we'll look at it slowly. Ulahashmid etchem, and to ultimately annihilate you. Ve'nisachtem me'al ha'adama. Whatever that root means, it's clearly passive because the mem afterwards suggests that you're going to, it's translated here as, be torn from. You're going to be ripped from that land. Not that you're doing the ripping, but you're going to be ripped from. Everyone would agree. Menachem would agree. Rashi would agree. Nun with a chirik. The tem meaning you plural. It sounds like the nitzal tem, and this does not mean and you will be ripping, but you will be ripped. Okay. Next one.
Next one. V'nigaftem lifnei oivechem.
I think you skipped one unless we have different texts.
Yeah, sorry, I did. V'nitatem biyad oyev.
Okay. Here we have 26th chapter of Vayikra. V'heveti alechem cherev. I, God, am going to bring a sword against you. Nokemet nekam brit, to kind of get my vengeance on the fact that you didn't observe my covenant. V'ne'esaftem el arechem. Slightly different forms. That's not as proof text. You will be the ones gathered up to your cities. V'shilachti dever b'tochechem. I'm going to send you pestilence. V'nitatem biyad oyev. Nun, with a chirik, tem ending. This does not mean that you're going to be doing giving, that you're delivering the hands of your enemies. No, you will be delivered unto. Passive, obvious. No one can disagree with it. Okay? We're going to do a few of these in a row. Stop me if anyone has any questions on it. Next one, Joanna.
V'nigaftem lifnei oivechem.
Oops, I shouldn't have closed that one because the same. That is the same chapter. So later on in that chapter, and by the way, this is now 2 in a row where Rashi is quoting from the Tochachot, the 2 places where the blessings and curses are said by God. First, he goes to the second one, Ki Tavo, and now he goes to the first one, Parshat Bechukotai, which we read a few weeks ago. V'natati fanai bachem. It's an interesting phrase that lisapanim, to turn face, is to be gentle and kind, but to place face, v'natati fanai bachem, is an angry thing. I'm gonna put my face upon you, and you're gonna wish I hadn't. Ve'nigaftem lifnei oivechem. The root is to be destroyed or routed, or maybe even to have it be a plague against you, like magefa. And it's the nun with a chirik, the tem ending, and it does not mean that you're going to rout your enemies, but you are going to be routed by your enemies. This is now third proof text in a row, and he keeps going. And I am interested in anyone who has an answer as to what, like, we get the point, Rashi, right? What's he doing? Is Rashi just showing how impressive it is? And it is unbelievably impressive that he has this recall, that he can just pick out without Sepharia, without the concordance, places where there's a root with the nun and a chirik and a second person plural to disprove Menachem ben Saruk. He just knows them. Okay, next one.
I'm also curious as to, like, if you were going to give a whole long litany, I would list them in order of appearance in the Tanakh. And he's like jumping all over the Tanakh. And that to me is curious. Like, is he trying to establish something by the order he gave them to us? And thus far, I can't make any sense of that.
Totally fascinating, and I can't make sense either. And even that he quotes two of the Tochachas in reverse order, and now he's going to jump to Ezekiel, right? And I don't think that any one of these is like, doesn't seem to be moving from the more obvious proof text to the least obvious one, the more compelling to the least compelling. This is all the same grammatical point, and I agree with you. I don't see a pattern. Larry, Diane, do you see a pattern?
Not a pattern. I'm thinking like a teacher. You say to your students, here's the example, see how many examples you can find. And they're just rattling off examples, and they got codified.
Interesting. So maybe we're seeing the example of Rashi having done this lesson with his students. I love that image. I have no idea how fanciful that image is, but I love it. I love that notion. Okay, Barry?
They seem to be in the order of progressively more severe.
The imagery is progressively more severe? Maybe. Let's see if that continues. I think that's arguable, but it's arguable in both directions, so it's a possibility. Tova, and then Sue?
Yeah, just on the broader question of why this Rashi, just the whole feel of this to me is of somebody who has had an area in which he is impassioned. He's hit a point where I get the feeling this is a long-standing controversy he has with this grammarian, right? That this is something that has come up before, and he's hit this point where it lights up that controversy and it just all pours out, like this is something he broods about or has brooded about. And here he has it in front of him, and he's sort of rattling off these examples because he's thought of it over and over again. It's something that has frustrated him in a sense, and that it just has that feeling of intensity, this outpouring of something about which he is uniquely fascinated and insisted on his understanding.
It's like Rashi waking up in the middle of the night, instead of saying Stella, he's saying, it's a chirik! It's a chirik! Great. Sue?
Well, thank you, Tova, because, I think that definitely works. But I of course, I'm trying to figure out what for. Like, what is he telling us? He's telling us it's not passive, it's not reflexive, it's passive. That's sort of yes, and it's all about the grammar and this particular point and all these examples because this is his thing. But that's what we're taking away from this, that it's that Rashi says it's a passive verb, it's not reflexive.
I mean, from what I can discern, and we're not even halfway through the comment yet. Yes, right? So the answer is yes, and I can't even qualify the yes. At the end of this, we, his students, will certainly know on a level that if we're paying attention, we'll never make the mistake again of how to distinguish between an active and a passive verb in the weirdo place of a three-letter root where sometimes the nun is missing. Like, we'll know it. Like, we'll have written on the board 1,000 times. I will never misunderstand a chirik under a nun in a passive verb again. Right. So, as a pedagogue, we'll have gotten the point. But I do think that that's the whole point. I don't think there's a bigger point here. I'm open to the possibility of it, but I don't see it. And even if Barry is correct that we have an increasingly more intense set of proof texts in terms of the imagery of God, I don't know if that argues wider to the little sermonette that Rashi is going to be giving on Shabbos about this, right?
If I could, because let's not look at this that the Israelites are going to get all this jewelry stuff. That's not what this is about. Little by little by little, this is going to become a very severe story on us.
Yeah,
we're going to go into a lot of trouble of this.
I want to know what I get from this class if I ever use this Rashi as a basis for a Yom Kippur sermon. I want to know, like, everyone else will think I'll have lost my mind, and 15 people scattered in the room will be cheering. Norm, go ahead.
I just thought this was a good time to point out that Menachem ben Saruk, who may have actually been a grandson rather than a son of Saruk, lived in Spain from 920 to 970, so he's almost exactly a century before Rashi, but only 1 century before him.
Thank you. If I knew that, I had forgotten it. I forgot that he was actually from Spain. Once again, it kind of boggles the mind to go back 1,100 years and imagine somebody in Spain writing a dictionary and it ending up not only being Rashi's hand, but Rashi knowing it well and relying on it. Like, how did that happen? How does that happen in medieval intellectual history, that some Yid writes a book by hand and it travels 500 miles or more and becomes essential text? I will live the entirety of my life and remain fascinated by how that happened.
I would think that if there was a noteworthy scholarly dictionary or book of grammar from Spain at that time, that Rashi is precisely whose hands it would fall into in France.
Yeah.
It wouldn't just be, some Garden Friday bookseller or yeshiva bacher. It would go to somebody who really is going to find it valuable.
Right, except that leans into a little bit of the fallacy that we discussed before as to whether or not Rashi was already Rashi by the time he was doing this, right? Like when did Rashi become Rashi? When did Rashi know he was going to be Rashi? When did others know he was going to be Rashi? At the time, was he just one of many people who are sitting in hovels in Provence or in Worms and writing this stuff, right? You go back or go to a different part of the world, like the Rambam story from Cordoba, Spain, to Fez, to Egypt, to Israel, and he's writing letters to the Jewish community in Yemen. You know how far away Yemen is from Cordoba? Like, you can't even get to Yemen today. And the Jews of Yemen had not only heard of the Rambam, but they were exchanging letters back and forth. It's an incredible thing to think about. Yemen, at the very, very end of the Arabian Peninsula, they got a letter there. So how these sages who are still known and beloved to us became known and authoritative in their generations, which also makes me wonder about the iceberg imagery. Like, are we just seeing a somewhat coincidental remnant, and were there 10 times as many Rashis that we just it got burned up before somebody wrote a copy, right? Or it was killed in the Crusades, right? So this stuff. Go ahead.
But we do know that one of Rashi's sons-in-law traveled to Spain trading, and that would have been a possible source to bring it back. So Rashi wouldn't necessarily have had this when he was still a young man, but later on, his son-in-law brings this seemingly significant text from Spain, and it is.
Yeah, great.
The Islamic literary world was phenomenal. We don't fully comprehend.
Sue, Rebecca, and then Tova.
We also have, some, modern narratives about how, the Jews at the time were merchants moving around the world and dropping their sons with various rabbis to study in yeshivas, set up here and there and everywhere as they, did their merchanting. And it might have come with those students and with those boys and with those, merchants that, we had a different way of moving things around the world that included goods, because that was that was our way of life. So it might have been like that. It might have transferred around like that. That was one thought that I had. And the other was that it's all of it is a basis of what we do now, even, modern day courts. It's like, you want to make a claim, you provide a million precedences to convince somebody that this is the way to see it. And, that's how we do now.
Of course, and I would think the more important the claim you're making, the more sure you're making your claim ironclad. And the question is why Rashi doesn't always give this many proof texts. Sometimes he gives one. Why this many proof texts in both directions to something relatively minor? But yes, by the end of this, we'll certainly know how Rashi believes this goes, and we won't make that mistake again if we at least follow Rashi. Rebecca, Tova, and then we'll go back to Joanna.
When I think about the question of why he's giving so much space to this, to me it seems like these two psukim, 21 and 22, could actually be left out, and so I'm not quite sure why they're in there. God is trying to convince Moses to go speak to the Israelites and explain what's going to happen, but this part of it, that they will leave with a lot of gold, is not that critical unless it's critical to motivate the Israelites to follow him. And if it's critical in that way, then it may be that he's trying to make the point that this really is the word, we will almost abuse the Egyptians and take their gold. And maybe it's a view that would motivate the Israelites to follow him out of, in this whole process. Because otherwise, he could have gone through, you'll go with the elders, you'll talk to Pharaoh, he will let you out, he won't, then he will. But this part of it is not so important to the process of convincing Moses that this whole process will work, I think, unless it's part of the motivation. So maybe that's why, maybe there's an argument going on in the back of his head on why do we need this? Why it's sort of a negative image of within the concept.
That's great, Rebecca. If we had to really do surgery on the different meanings of the roots that Rashi is dealing with here, and these. At some level, even these two words are distinctions without a difference, right? Linnatzel, to take advantage of, to exploit, to despoil. Lahatzil, to rescue, right? To pull out from something else. If there's a fine distinction, I think you're right that the former is a little more. It's not more violent. It's certainly it's more active. It's more sticking it to the ones that you're taking it from. Whereas the latter seems to be removing something that you're due anyway. Lahatzil is to rescue something that deserved to be rescued. Linatzel is to go in there and to pull something out that doesn't necessarily have to come out. So if Rashi, if either consciously or unconsciously in the back of Rashi's mind, Rashi wants us to understand God telling Moshe on behalf of the Israelites, you're going to stick it to them, which is different than. Yeah, you're gonna take what you're due. Well, whether or not you're due it, it's not a hatzalah. This is not a rescue operation. This is an extraction, and maybe that's what's so significant. He doesn't say that, but we can conjecture on it, and that's the only possible way I think to make a distinction between these two roots in terms of meaning, right? Just to take something that could very easily have stayed there versus to rescue something that was due to come out. Yeah, great. Thanks, Rebecca.
I just want to add one other thing. The other use of that root that comes to my mind constantly is Natzel, which is, again, sort of, to ask forgiveness which is a completely other way of understanding this, of somehow they are somehow making the Egyptians ask for forgiveness for taking their gold or something like that. But I don't know if Hitnatzel comes from the same root, because I don't quite see it. I mean, does it mean emptying yourself, but it was just another use of the root that I thought sort of made it more complicated.
So you've tiptoed into one of the rabbit holes of my mind when I think about Hebrew, right? And I think about Hebrew and I think about Israeli culture. I remember I was pretty deep into my knowledge of Hebrew before I'd ever heard the verb lehit natsel. And for those who don't know it, lehit natsel in modern Hebrew means to apologize, right? Because the more common way of apologizing in Hebrew is not to say ani mitnatsel, but ani mitzta'er. I'm sorry, right? Mitzta'er is it's another interesting. It's a hit pa'el of the verb tsa'ar. I make myself pained. I accept that tsa'ar upon myself. So in colloquial Hebrew, you bump into someone, ani mitzta'er. It's much more formal. Maybe it's more severe to look someone in the face and say, ani mitnatsel. I apologize to you. Now, again, translation problem. We use the word apologize. We know what it means. That's not what the word lehit natsel means. It's just how it's used. Lehit natsel, you're exactly right, is a hit pa'el verb based on the verb that Rashi thinks we're dealing with here. I exploit myself. I somehow remove something from myself. Am I removing my dignity? Am I removing my certainty? I have always wondered about that verb. And I don't even know, Rebecca, when in Hebrew that becomes used in that way. Right? I wish Vered were on today. I don't know if this is a Eliezer ben Yehuda thing. I don't think lehit natsel operated as a verb meaning to apologize in the time of Rashi. I don't think he knew that verb. It's my guess. Right? I think the biblical and rabbinic lehit natsel is more in the context we're dealing with. So I've always wondered where the verb came from, and I've never done the research. So
if you look it up, you can even Google the word and the root, and it does come from medieval times. It says, and then there's some reference to Shemot. Zot v'zehu hitnatzluto shel Aharon. But I'm not sure that's what it means there, so it doesn't have the link.
Yeah, that's a midrash. Hitnatzluto shel Aharon is in a midrash. I forgot on what verse. I'll have to look into that. If we had the I actually don't have the Eliezer ben Yehuda dictionary on my shelf, which is the kind of dictionary someone like me should have, but I've never owned it, and I wonder if he goes into it. But I really appreciate that association. Tova's hand is up, and then Larry Diane.
Well, the conversation's moved a little bit past it, but I was thinking of the whole issue of how he could have known of these things, how they could have been passed. And personally, I didn't find it so hard to believe because I know Shmuel HaNagid, when a sort of things were written to his credit. Some of the things that were written to his credit was one that he had funded and was a philanthropist in the copying of the Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and the Talmud, with the parentheses, these being also holy scripts, which is very interesting. But that was one of the efforts that would be going on, is the production, the copying of, and presumably the spread of. Shmuel HaNagid in Spain knew that in Jerusalem they were short of funds for lighting lamps at night, and that was one of his forms of tzedakah, was giving money to light lamps in Jerusalem. And your own example of the letters to Yemen. So the Jews were merchants. They were traveling, and often I think traveled with copies because there was a market and interest in them. And at the same time, though, there was more back and forth contact within the Islamic world. That's one of the things that distinguishes Ashkenaz from Sephardi, is this very interconnected Islamic world, whereas Christendom a little bit more cut off, but there was big merchant contact between the Rhineland and Spain, because we know, I believe, if I'm right, that Rabbeinu Gershom, one of the reasons for his takana on having only one wife was in part, I think, related to the problem of merchants who would travel into Spain, take a wife while they were there, and then would basically abandon that wife in returning. And
really?
That was at least one of the issues, aside from issues within Ashkenaz itself. So we know that contact. We know that the great academies on the Rhineland, which is where Rashi studied, were in contact with the academies in Mesopotamia. They had contact there despite being within Christendom. So I don't so much see maybe Rashi coming across Menachem ben Seruch, but probably having him be a source in those academies where he studied. It might even have been a source of great contention when he was a student arguing about some of these things. But the way I pictured or understood that world, that kind of transmission of documents, I think would be much more common than we may think today.
And this image of spreading Torah and knowledge as we spread merchandise, right? Like
yes,
we really
absolutely.
have been the people of the book.
Yeah.
I always like clarifying when people make references to make sure everyone on the class knows what is being talked about. Rabbeinu Gershom was a Spanish sage, and he was considered Me'or HaGolah.
Not Spanish. He was Ashkenazi. Rabbeinu Gershom. No, you mean Shmuel HaNagid? Shmuel HaNagid.
Yes, and except I'm speaking about Rabbeinu Gershom. Yes, so right. Ashkenazi sage called Me'or HaGolah, the light of the diaspora, and he made a takana, an edict, that was supposed to last 1,000 years. He made several edicts that were considered to be obligatory upon all of Ashkenazi Jewry. One, the more well-known one, is that having more than one wife, which at least, except for the example that you just mentioned, which I was not aware of, was de facto no longer operative in Ashkenazi Jewry. Anyway, he made it officially prohibited. He also made it prohibited to read other people's mail. Right. That one gets a little bit less press. And I remember that the Takana must have been like in the year, 990 or 999. It was the 1,000 years was up in my rabbinic lifetime, because I remember there was a conversation about do we renew it for another 1,000 years? Yeah. And the answer was yes. So that's who Rabbeinu Gershom is. Larry, Diane, and then we're gonna be ending this class less than halfway through this Rashi. Go ahead, Larry, Diane.
I can't believe that. So a serious comment first. I spoke too soon about Rashi being silent in verse 9 in Bereshit 31, because in verse 16 he does comment on the Atzil, and it's relevant to what I think what we were just talking about. And he says Lashon Hifrish v'chein kol Lashon Hatzala shebam Mikra Lashon Hafrasha shemafrisho min hara'a umin ha'oyev. Hatzil means separated or taken away. Similarly, all forms of the hifil of this root occurring in Scripture, usually translated by to deliver, to rescue, mean taking away. For one who rescues a person takes him away from the misfortune or from enemy. And then to go to mitnatzel, okay, that would be as if to take myself away from the misfortune of what I have done to you. Could be an explanation for why that is. I know you don't want to take time, so I have two words: Spencer Turnbull. You didn't see? No hitter.
When, yesterday?
As pathetic as they are, the Tigers got a no hitter.
You know what? Even a poor tailor is entitled to some happiness, as much as one said. Even a Tiger fan deserves to have some joy. Let's give a kol hakavod to Joanna for having gotten us about 40% through. We'll pick up next week for the exciting conclusion of Rashi's commentary of Chapter 3, verse 22. I wish everybody a wonderful week, a healthy week. I'll see you all soon.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.